Well, today we start a study in Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13. And we've entitled the study, The End is Near. Now the end is near. An unveiling of the end. Today is also another special day for the youth. It's Ice Cream Sunday. I had to say that for the youth. Yeah, I have to set the age limit, won't I? But we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 13. And when we think about the future, when we think about end times, it always makes us curious. We always want to know, what is the future going to be like in terms of what the Bible says? What is the future? When will the Lord return? What will happen, in the next 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, if the Lord doesn't return sooner? What's the world going to be like? There are movies that are made that try to give you an anticipation of the future, It turns out, if you ever remember the movie Back to the Future, I don't know if you've seen that movie. It came out in the 80s. And when I was a teenager, I watched that movie. And when the main character goes to the future, the date that he went to was about a month ago in 2015. That was the date that was in the car that he went to in the future. And it turned out that the cars in that day from that movie, in 2015, the cars could actually fly. But I don't see any flying cars. We're still actually using diesel, But there's always the movies that try to talk about the future and try to show us what the future will be like. But in Mark chapter 13, we get a good picture of the future based on what Jesus said. There are really two questions that have to be answered in our study of Mark chapter 13. The first question is, why does Jesus in this chapter, at this point in time, talk about future things? Why does he do that? And I'm going to answer that question today. The other 3 weeks of our study answers the second question. What actually did Jesus say about the future? So we have two questions to answer, and I have to answer the why question before I can answer the what question, because if I go ahead and answer the what question, you will not understand why. And it's more important to understand why first. Then, when you look at what Jesus actually said, it will make sense to you. You will understand it much better. Otherwise, there will be confusion. There is a similar passage, a record or an account of what we read in Mark 13 in Matthew chapter 24 and 25. That's two lengthy chapters, but it's the same account, or it's a narrative of the same event. This event only happened once. Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is located a little bit outside of the city of Jerusalem. And as we know, Jesus is in that final week of his life here on earth. And he's had these debates with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders. And now he's left for the day, for the afternoon. He's sitting on the Mount of Olives with his disciples. They're relaxing, and the questions are asked by the disciples, and Jesus begins to answer those questions. So it takes place right outside of the city of Jerusalem, this unveiling of the end that Jesus provides for his disciples. However, what prompted Jesus to do this? What prompted Jesus to have to talk about the end times? It's a combination of a few things. Number one, Jesus had been interacting with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the religious leaders. He had been debating them. They had been asking him questions, trying to entrap him, trying to accuse him of something, and on every occasion, Jesus literally took care of the situation, answered the question, and answered it so brilliantly that they could not find anything to accuse him. They didn't like his answers. They hated Jesus so much it made their blood boil. But on no occasion could they find any justifiable reason to accuse him of treason or of being unbiblical. Nothing whatsoever. And at the end of it, Jesus asked them a question and they weren't able to answer it. One of the things that the Pharisees and the religious leaders assumed, they assumed that they were smarter than Jesus. The scribes, they were the certifiable geniuses. And they figured, they thought, we're smarter than Jesus. How can he outwit us? How can he always answer every question? And it really bothered them. It made them, get angry. They want to stomp their feet and say, how in the world could Jesus do this? Well, they never factored in that he's God. He knows the end from the beginning. He knows the Pharisees and Sadducees better than they know themselves. He can look in and see their hearts. They never thought about that. So from their perspective, Jesus was just outsmarting them and they did not like it. So there was this controversy. After the questioning had ended, Jesus, this is recorded in Matthew chapter 23. He basically tells the people, don't listen to the religious leaders. This is similar to the text from last Sunday that we looked at. Don't follow that crowd. Don't follow those religious leaders. They're so prideful. They want to sit in the chief seats. And when they walk in to the synagogue, they want to be recognized as the elite. They look for it. They want everybody to literally to bow and kiss their ring or kiss their feet. They were very proud. And Jesus said, beware of them. And in Matthew 23, he describes their character. He describes who they are. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you, you hypocrites. When he says woe, it's like proclaiming a cursing. The same idea that you would find in the Old Testament. So he tells the crowd, don't follow them. Their doctrine is wrong. Their lifestyle is wrong. They'll lead you astray. And after that is over, at the end of Matthew 23, Jesus makes a statement. He looks at the city of Jerusalem. It's like he's looking over the city. And he says, he basically proclaims to the city that I'm gone, that I'm no longer going to be here, and that you will not see me again until you call me blessed. What he's talking about is that he's proclaiming judgment on the city. He's saying basically like God would say in Ezekiel's prophecy, the Spirit is gone. I'm leaving. And I'm casting judgment upon you. And that statement that he makes openly so that everyone could hear rings in the disciples' ears. That remains in the disciples' brain. And as they're walking out of the city that day, they asked Jesus some questions. In Mark chapter 13, at the beginning of the chapter, it says, as he came out of the temple area, where he had just made those statements about the religious leaders and proclaimed judgment on the city. One of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what buildings." He's referring to the temple itself, to the structure of the temple. And he's saying, "Look, Jesus, this thing's huge. This thing is big." It actually took over 40 years for that temple and the whole temple court area that the disciples are referring to. It took over 40 years for that to be constructed. And many people were on the construction crew. These were great buildings, and in their mind, nothing could ever happen to them. They were solid. They would never go away. And so the disciples are saying, "Jesus, you're basically telling the Pharisees and Sadducees, you're telling them to go away. You're casting cursing on them. That's our religious leaders you're doing that to. And then you tell the city that you're gone and that the Spirit has departed and you will not see me again until you call me blessed. So you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And when you say that, you're talking about the kingdom age, you're talking about the future. How can you say such things about the religious leaders? How can you say this? How can you justify it when, you got this big property here, you got this temple, they own the place? How can you say all these things? They're great buildings. They're wonderful stones. And Jesus said, "You see these great buildings? You see them?" They're shaking their head. "Yeah, we see them." "There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." What? Take this literally. He's not spiritualizing here. He's looking at that building like the disciples. He says, "You see that? Yeah, you see the structure?" He said, "Let me tell you something. That building is coming down. It's going to be leveled to the ground. Not one stone will be left upon another." For the disciples to hear that, what it tells them is not just that a building's going to go away. That building represented the religious system of Israel. It represented everything. It stood as a monument for the whole religious system. And Jesus says that is going to come to an end. You want to know why I spoke cursing to the religious leaders? You want to know why I spoke judgment to the city of Jerusalem? You want to know why I did that? Because just as God the Father did it in the Old Testament, I'm doing it today because I know what the future is going to behold. That building's coming down. You may think that building's great, nothing would ever happen to it. How could anybody destroy that? He says it will come down. And they're like, "What?" Not what. They're like, "What?" He says, "There will not be left here one stone upon another will not be thrown down." So as they sit on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, 4 of the disciples, they come to him privately, and they say, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" "Jesus, you say this is going to happen?" I can imagine these 4 guys when they're walking out of the city with Jesus and they're going to the Mount of Olives. That may take about an hour, 30 minutes to an hour. Okay, there's no jeepneys to get you there. Okay, you're walking it, and so imagine for the hour they're probably going, "Who's going to talk to him? I mean, is he crazy? Can that come down?" And they're asking, "We got to go to him. We got to talk to him." So the disciples they're sitting there on the Mount of Olives and they're asking, hey, when is this going to happen? And when they ask, what is the sign? They're asking, how do we know it's about ready to happen? Is there something that tips us off, that shows us beforehand? You know, think of this. You got the Robinson's supermarket or mall up in Antipolo. When you drive up Samulong or you go up Ortigas Extension, they'll have a sign there that says Robinson's Antipolo Place. And the mall's been open since October of last year. Well, the sign, what does the sign do? It points you to the place. It's not the place itself, but it tells you you're on the right road to get there. So they're asking, when is this going to happen? And what is the sign that will show us that it's about to happen? We want to know, we want to know what happens first before the big event. They're curious. And what they're asking about the future, but they really don't realize the full extent of what they're asking. They're just wanting to know when that building's coming down. But in reality, they're asking a much bigger question. What you have to understand is that what Jesus is going to provide for these disciples, he's going to answer their question, but he's going to answer it in such a way that they never imagined. Because the question that they ask really prompts something much bigger than just the destruction of this temple. Something much more important. Much more impacting of the whole world, not just the city of Jerusalem. Most of the people, the religious leaders especially, never even thought that Jesus was smart. Hey, he comes from Galilee. Has anything ever good come out of Galilee? That would be what they would think. But the Lord of glory is going to speak, and he's going to address about the future. He's going to talk about the future. And what he says, and we'll start looking at that next week and the next 2 weeks. What he says is so amazing. What he talks about is so life-changing. And everything he speaks about in regards to the future, it's detailed. It's accurate. And this will happen just as he says. However, for us to understand the context in which he says these words, we have to do a little bit of a background study, okay? I hope what I'm about to tell you in the next few minutes does not bore you to tears. If it does, just don't tell me. That way I'll feel like I've done something good here. If you understand what I'm about to tell you and share with you, what Jesus says will make much better sense. You'll understand it, okay? Because what Jesus is talking about is a specific period of history that has not happened yet, even for us. The events that Jesus speaks of in Mark chapter 13, he also talks about these events in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, have not happened yet. There's still future events related to our time frame, not just the disciples. These events are still needing to be accomplished, and they will happen. And I'll tell you right now, none of the events in this chapter that Jesus talks about, none of this has anything to do with the Philippines. None of this has anything to do with America, per se, okay? Not specifically. You may hear about a preacher in the Philippines or proclaimed prophet who likes to take passages from Matthew 24 and 25 or Mark chapter 13, and he wants to relate them to what's going on in the Philippines. He's going to find some flood in here, some typhoon, some earthquake, and he's going to talk about how this is related to an event that happened here in the Philippines. If you find a preacher that does that, the preacher is not interpreting these passages correctly. I just said that on video. That's just the way it is. If you want to understand what Jesus says, what context it's in, what time frame he's speaking of, you have to understand a little bit of the background. Now, for the disciples, what I'm about to tell you, they would understand. At least to a point, they would understand. They would have been raised in this system. They would understand what I'm about to tell you. But here's the answer to the why. Why Jesus brings this up. Number one is just so he wants the disciples to know, hey, I know what the future is. In contrast to the religious leaders who have no clue. Secondly, I want to help you understand better what God has planned before the world ever was created. Now, I hope you have your handy dandy chart. You ever heard the phrase handy dandy? It's an expression that we use in American. I have no idea what it means. It just sounds good. Okay. I drew this up. This is my handwriting, except for the chart at the bottom. And that I got from a resource. If you're going to understand what Jesus is talking about, you have to understand another passage. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 to 27. If you have a Bible, turn to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. Very important chapter. If you take a look at this chart, this is a timeline. And you need to know about some events that's happened in the history of the nation of Israel so that you can understand about the future. When you look at the J there at the end, the chart at the top, J represents Jeremiah. You've heard of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah? Well, Jeremiah preached in the land of Israel. They divided the land of Israel. The land of Israel was divided into two kingdoms, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. He preached in the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom would be like the area around Jerusalem, Judea, what is known as Jerusalem, Judea in Jesus' time. Jeremiah preached to the people. And Jeremiah, if you read the book of Jeremiah, you will find that Jeremiah preaches and prophesies that since our nation is a sinful nation, we have disobeyed God, we have violated His word, we don't follow the Lord, God is going to judge us. And what's going to happen is a country, God has told me that He's going to send a nation to our country, to our land, that's going to judge us. It's going to be God's instrument of judgment upon us. He's going to send this Gentile country to do the business of judging us. Well, that happened. Jeremiah actually lived as an old man to see the day. In 597 BC, the nation of Babylon came into Jerusalem and took people captive, Jews, and took them to the land of Babylon, which is now modern-day Iraq. Okay? These Jews were taken captive. Imagine somebody, another nation, coming over here, taking Filipinos, putting them on a boat, and taking them to another country. Are you going to like if that happens? No. Well, people of Israel didn't like that happened, but God allowed the nation of Babylon to do this because of judging the nation of Israel. This was in God's judgment. There were 3 deportations. The first one was 597 BC. The next one was 10 years later, 587. In the first one, 597, a young man at the time was in that first group. That was Daniel. In the second deportation, 587, It was the prophet Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's prophecy, that book, all those prophecies are recorded, or let's just say it this way, those prophecies that were spoken happened while Ezekiel was living in the land of Babylon. In 582, it was the third deportation. But when that deportation happened, there was also a destruction of the city at that time. The nation of Babylon came in, they literally destroyed the city. They destroyed the temple, they destroyed the city walls, gone. And so that Jerusalem captivity, Israel in captivity took place. Now Daniel, you can read the prophet Daniel, the book of Daniel, and you'll find that Daniel outlived the nation of Babylon. In Daniel chapter 9, there was a new kingdom that had taken over the known world, the land of the Medes and the Persians. They had come in and wiped Babylon out. Well, when they wiped Babylon out, they inherited all these Jewish captives. The Jewish captives were still living in the same area, but it was no longer controlled by Babylon, it was controlled by the Medes and the Persians. Interestingly, though, Jeremiah, when he preached, it's recorded in Jeremiah 25, verses 11 and 12, chapter 29, verses 10 to 12, or 10, I think that may be 14, 10 to 14. There was one of those passages there talks about how God, through the prophet Jeremiah, even before the first captivity took place, the word was spoken by Jeremiah from God saying that there was going to be 70 years, literally 70 years, when we are going to be in judgment. After 70 years, God's going to do something. I think it's the passage where it says, I have plans for you for peace and for, sometimes people, I've known Christians who take that out of context, try to make that their life verse. That has nothing to do with God blessing you today. Give you hope in the future. Has nothing to do with your personal life. That verse is all about God doing something to bless the people of Israel after 70 years of being in captivity. In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel has lived to that period of 70 years. In Daniel chapter 9, 70 years have passed. That's why it says at the beginning in Daniel chapter 9, in the first year of Darius the son of Ahasuerus, by a descent of a Mede, he's one of the Medes and Persians, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. Chaldeans is another name for the Babylonians. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books of what? The books of Jeremiah, the writings of Jeremiah, the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolation of Jerusalem. Remember I told you Jerusalem was annihilated, wiped out in 582? You have 70 years beyond that, and Daniel is living during that time, and he says, okay, God, you said in 70 years. And Daniel is expecting God to do something, because he's actually lived to see the day when 70 years have passed. He's on the verge. And so the whole chapter of Daniel 9, he's praying, he's confessing the sins of himself, the sins of the people, and he's waiting to see what God's going to do. And an angel visits Daniel. Angel says to Daniel, I was dispatched. God sent me. God heard your prayer. But Daniel, it's not all going to happen right now. Yes, 70 years have passed. But it doesn't mean that God's going to restore everything back to the way it was instantly. That's not his overall plan. Daniel, I'm going to give you more information about the future. And what he tells him in verses 24 to 27 will blow your mind. Literally is unreal. When you read Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 to 27, it sounds like something cryptic that you would find in archaeology. It sounds like it's code words. Just listen to this. It says, verse 24, Daniel 9, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. 70 weeks? What are you talking about? 70 weeks? To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, to anoint a most holy place. What is this about? Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. You know, what is this about? This seems like cryptic, like you need a code book to figure it out. What's this 62 weeks? What's this 70 weeks? 7 weeks? What's this all about? What the angel does, he gives Daniel a preview of the future. From the current day to the actual end. Now, for the Jew, the end would be the end of everything. To a Jew would be the beginning of what's called the kingdom period. The Jews had been promised that God would return and set up his kingdom. They're looking for their Messiah, correct? And Jesus is their Messiah, but they didn't want to see him as a Messiah. The Jews, you ask a Jew today, you still looking for your Messiah? Yeah. Do you know he already showed up once? Huh? No, we're still looking for him. Oh, he's already been here. He's going to come back. Who's that? Jesus? Nah, he's not a Messiah. They rejected him as Messiah. But Jesus was the true Messiah. He is the true Messiah. But it's always been in the heart of a Jew to look for when the Messiah would come. And God is, through the angel, is telling Daniel, I can tell you in how many years the Messiah will return. What? Another one of those. What? You mean to tell me you're going to give me a preview of the future that actually tells me a time frame? Yeah. If you take a look at the chart below, I know it's kind of fuzzy. I didn't draw that, but hopefully you can understand it. I'm going to give you the layman's translation of this, of what this passage is about. 70 weeks represents, the idea was 70 years, right? 70 years, Jeremiah was talking about 70 years. That was what the context was that Daniel was referring to. Jeremiah talks about 70 years. It's not literally 70 weeks is a bad translation from the Hebrew. It's literally 77s. And what the angel is saying to Daniel, it's not going to be just 70 years. That 70 years is come and gone. You're going to have to think of it as 70 or as 7 years, or 70 years times 7. In other words, you're going to have to think of it as there's another eschatological chart or timeline that's about ready to begin, and it's lasting for 490 years. And Daniel's probably thinking, man, I've just been through 70. You mean I got to wait another 490? Yeah. What God is going to do is not right now, Daniel. It's still for the future, and it's going to be in 490 years. It will happen in 490 years. And what he does is he breaks down everything into time chunks, what I call time chunks, or different things that are mentioned, so that you know that time is progressing. You know that God's doing what he says he's going to do. When he talks about everything coming to an end, finish transgression, put an end to sin, when he says that, when he talks about those things, he's talking about the beginning of the kingdom. He's talking about the end of everything. And he's saying, you want to know when everything comes to an end? It will happen in 490 years. Wow. So, if it's going to happen in 490 years, you need to know when the 490 years starts. Okay? You need to know when the 490 years starts. When does it start? He talks about that there's a decree made. A decree to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. That decree that he's referring to is actually dated. There's a date for that. It was made in 444 BC, many years after Daniel had died. And the record of that is in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 8. Remember Ezra and Nehemiah? They lived during the captivity. And in Nehemiah chapter 2, Nehemiah wanted to go back and help start rebuilding the city. He had it in his heart, and he asked permission. The king granted it because God was working in the heart of that Persian king, and he sent Nehemiah back to help rebuild the wall and start the process of rebuilding the temple. That temple that was rebuilt was the temple that Jesus was referring to when he said those stones will not be left upon another. It took many years for that thing to be rebuilt. Eventually the city would be rebuilt, and then later the temple would be rebuilt as well. The date in which that happened, that decree was made to give the people of Israel permission to go back, was 444 BC. Okay? So, at that point in time, the divine clock begins to tick. From that point, 490 years later, everything comes to an end. Interestingly, though, the weeks are divided. There's 7 weeks, and then there's 62 weeks. If you add all that together, that is 69 of the 70 weeks. If you take that and break it down in terms of a Jewish calendar, the date in which the last day of the 69th week occurred was March the 30th, AD 33. You know what March the 30th was? 1 week before the resurrection of Jesus Christ. 1 week. That was Palm Sunday. If you go to Luke chapter 19, when Jesus walks into Jerusalem, he says to the people of Jerusalem, if you had known this your day. What the day he's referring to is the last day of the last day of the 483 years that had transpired from Daniel's 70-week prophecy. He says, if you had known that, you would know who I am. Because it says in Daniel that after 483 years, some events take place. The Messiah is cut off. That's referring to Jesus' death. Also, it talks about how the city and the temple will be destroyed. That event, when Jesus said, not one stone left upon another, that event happened in AD 70, about 37 years after the resurrection of Christ. There's a Jewish historian, his name's Josephus. You ever heard of Josephus? Some of you may have heard of him, may not. He was a Jewish historian. He details the account of when the temple was destroyed. He talks about it. He writes about it. And if you read his account, you will find out that the Romans came in and they destroyed everything. They hated the Jews so much, they destroyed everything. And after they killed every Jew they could find, they said to the general who was commanding them, what can we do now? He said, you see those buildings? Level. destroy everything that you see. Destroy it. Destroy it all. So they did. They leveled the temple. They leveled it to the ground. Gone. And Jesus' prophecy about one stone not being left upon another came true. So this was announced in the Old Testament. This was announced to Daniel many, many, many years ago. You want to know why Jesus kept talking about the leveling of the temple? The leveling of the temple? He would say this in other places, especially those last few days, because he's referring the people back to the prophecy of Daniel. So what had happened was 483 years of the 490 had passed. But the clock, the divine clock, even though time kept going, the divine clock came to a stop, came to an end. And only 483 years had passed. That means that at some point in the future, we still have 1 week to go. We still have 1 week, one series of 7 years left in the clock, in the divine clock. That 7-year period is what the scriptures will refer to as the Great Tribulation. A period that's going to come on the earth that has never been like it and never will be again. It's a period of terrible judgment, a period of unlike in any human history. This time, this period of history is going to be so bad, it's going to make Hitler look like he's a kindergartner. You're going to think Hitler was the nicest guy on the planet compared to what's going to happen during this tribulation period. There's 7 more years on the clock. The thing is, you had 483, but now you have a gap. There's a period of time that keeps going, but still the 7 years is still future. It hasn't started yet, that last 7-year period. You say, well, what starts it up? There's going to be what the scriptures call an Antichrist. You've heard about the Antichrist? There's going to be a guy who's an Antichrist. He thinks he's going to promote himself as being God. He's going to promote himself, and it's not the guy in Davao, okay? It's just not going to be. But there's a guy coming he's going to pronounce himself to be God, be the Messiah, be everybody that, be the best man on the planet. And it's not Hillary Clinton. It's not Obama, okay? Some have said that. And this guy is going to come. He's going to be the savior for the world. And he's going to announce himself as being the savior for everyone. He's going to be your best friend. And the thing is he's actually going to be the Antichrist. He's going to hate the true God. He's going to hate Christ, the true Messiah. He's going to proclaim himself to be the Messiah. And you know what he's going to do? He's going to set up a treaty with the nation of Israel. This is going to happen in the future. And when he sets up that treaty, this is the last verse 27. He sets up a treaty. The day he does that, the last 7-year period starts up. The clock starts ticking again. That treaty hasn't happened. I know Israel's had treaties in the past. None of those are that. This treaty is going to be made with the many. Israel's included. It's a peace treaty. And when that happens, the last 7 years begins. If you look at the chart, it talks about the coming prince. That coming prince that's listed in verse 27 is the Antichrist. He sets up a treaty with the many for 1 week. That's a period of 7 years, what the scriptures call the Great Tribulation period. The book of Revelation describes that period of time. After that 7-year period is up, then the 490 years are up, and guess what? The Lord returns to establish his kingdom. If you want to understand what Jesus is about to talk about in Mark chapter 13, what time period is he referring to? When the disciples say, when is the sign of your end? When's this all going to come to pass? What Jesus really answers is the question, what happens during the last week of Daniel's prophecy? What Jesus is going to refer to is the 70th week of Daniel, the Great Tribulation period. Say, how do you know that? How do you know that that's what Jesus is referring to? Look back at Mark 13. Before we look at verse 14, I'm going to read that to you in a minute, and then we're going to close. But take a look at the chart again. You see that it says in that Daniel 70th week, the last week, it divides it up half and half. You see that? Okay, that's 7 years. So the halfway point is what? 3.5 years? There's something that happens at the 3.5 year period. At the end of verse 27 of Daniel 9, it talks about the middle of the week. The midpoint of the week. So if you're talking about 7 years, the middle would be 3.5 years. Okay? Something is going to happen halfway through the 7 year period that's going to change everything. It's going to be a major event in that period of time. Again, the 70th week, everything is still future. None of that is happening right now. Okay? But when it begins, and I'll just say this, I don't think we'll be here when that happens. It's another story, but anyway. But when that event happens, when the 7 years is happening, at the halfway point, after 3.5 years, a bigger event happens. A very important event. It's called the abomination of desolation. It's how it's referred to in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Look at what Jesus says in verse 14 of Mark chapter 13. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be. You know where he's going to be? In the temple area. Let the reader understand. In Matthew's account of this same passage, when Jesus refers to the abomination of desolation, he also adds, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet. As spoken by Daniel. What Jesus is referring to is that midpoint of the 7 year period. How do I know that what Jesus is referring to is events that are still future to us? That's the 70th week of Daniel, the Great Tribulation period, because Jesus says so. What we're about to look at over the next 3 weeks are events that's going to take place on this earth that have not happened yet and will not I don't think we'll actually see it fully, because I think we'll actually be gone. And I'll explain that as we go. But what Jesus is going to tell the disciples is about the last 7 years of God's prophetic timetable to bring in his millennial kingdom. See, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious leaders, thought Jesus was loony. They thought he didn't know anything. He was dumb. They thought, this is not an educated man. No. He's better than any educated man. Here is the Lord of glory, who's going to provide for the disciples an unveiling, a revelation of the last 7 years that God has established for his plan to set up his kingdom. And it will happen just as he says. That's why he commands at the very end of Mark 13, stay awake. Umisi nakayo. Stay awake. Stay alert. Because what you're about to see, what you're about to hear, very, very important. Prophecy, when properly understood, is not boring. It actually, this is better than any Hollywood movie. Because what Jesus describes will happen. Here's what we're going to do. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at the Mark 13 passage. I'm going to take you verse by verse through what Jesus talks about, all the things he talks about. I will also be probably referring back to Matthew 24, because that's another account. They're very similar. And I'm also going to take you to the book of Revelation. The things that Jesus describes are also recorded in the book of Revelation. It's all about the future. So, one day the end will come. And as the title says, now the end is near. But it's not today, but it will come. And the way our world is going, it's got to happen sooner than later, I think. We may be the last generation. We may not die. Our generation may be the generation that sees the Lord return before even this 7 years starts up. But anyway, until then, we can read his word, study it, and understand the beauty of that Christ does know what's going to happen in the future. And you know what? Here's an application. We may not know everything that's going to happen in the future. And we can begin to understand what Christ tells us. But when it comes to your future, when it comes to your daily activities, you know, God knows the day you were born. He knows the day you're going to die. Okay? He knows your whole life. You can't surprise him. But this is a glorious thing. He gave you life. And one day, if you truly know him, you're going to be with him, and you're going to be able to experience his glorious future forever and ever. That is a praise. So when you're living your life, doing everything, getting ready for a wedding, getting ready for church planning conference tomorrow, when you're getting ready for things, know that God already has it planned out. He knows. He'll take care of you. It's a comfort that we may not know the future, but he does. And that's good. Okay? So, get excited. Come back next week. Maybe, just maybe, we could have a little broader ice cream social. Never know. Youth for today. Not even me. I have to say no. Anyway, let's pray. Dear God, we do give you thanks for today. Thank you for all your blessings to us. And Lord, what a beauty it will be to see the future as you tell it to us. Lord, you have a plan, a big plan of redemption. You got something that's beyond even Daniel's comprehension, even our comprehension. And you let us understand a little bit about it. And even a little bit, the kayunti, a little bit part that you let us understand is still life-changing for us. We know that you're on your throne. We know that you're sovereign and you're Lord and you're God. You do know the future. And Lord, you will take care of our future as well. Lord, we give you praise and give you thanks. In Jesus' name. Amen.